Welcome back, everyone. This will be the last video for Chapter 4, Sensation and Perception. So in the previous video, then we talked about Gestalt laws and Gestalt psychology and how that incorporates visual information and how it's processed or perceived in the brain, and how we can use this to talk about visual illusions. So just a reminder of the 4 Gestalt laws of organization. We have 1, the law of similarity, 2, the law of proximity, the law of closure, and then the law of continuity. Now we're going to see how some of these play a role in some optical illusions. The first optical illusion is here. So this illusion actually has a special name, not that you need to know, but it's Fraser's spiral. That's the name of this. And this illustrates Gestalt's law of continuity. And that's because if you follow these spirals, the spirals here that go inward, what you'll actually find is it's not spirals at all. It's actually multiple concentric circles. So if we just follow this around, it's one circle. It's not a spiral at all. But what our brain does is it kind of connects all these circles together into one continuous line. So that's using the law of continuity. And the spiral is created by your nervous system because that perception is more consistent with the continuity of individual elements. Now, when talking about perceptual consistencies, then we can kind of split it into 3 things. We have shape consistency, size consistency, and brightness consistency. So, for example, shape consistency, then we could say a friend's face has a different shape when you look at their profile than looking at them straight on. And has your friend's face changed? No. So that's shape consistency. So even though what you're looking at, the visual information, is a different shape, your brain can recognize that consistency, that it's actually the same person, rather than saying all of a sudden it's a different person. And that's because we recognize people on multiple features. And without these perceptual consistencies, we would not be able to recognize familiar stimuli under varying conditions. So another example would be size consistency. So when you're walking to your car, the image on your retina gets larger as you're getting closer. So do you perceive your car to be growing? No, right? And that's because it's a perceptual consistency. And then finally, an example of brightness consistency would be the color of your jacket may be different in full sunlight than in shade. So brightness consistency is something your brain usually does very well at. And, if it's something you're familiar with, then you'll definitely be able to recognize it in different brightnesses. So here's another example of size consistency. So the perception of the size of an object remains relatively consistent, even though the images on our retina change in size with varying differences. In other words, we recognize in this image here that this guy that's sitting way back there is the same size human as the guy sitting closer to us. Even though if we measure the size of the image of him versus the size of the image of this gentleman up front, they're actually very different sizes. But what our brain can do is recognize that it's further back in the distance and use size consistency to understand that something further away will look smaller. So our brain understands this, even though this is the reality when talking about just the measurements in an image. So let's start talking about these illusions. Illusions are perceptual consistencies show that context can produce illusions. So converging lines can disrupt size consistency. So for example, here, these two men are the same size in real life, but he is further away than this guy. But we can't perceive that because of the lines on the floor. Now, if we look at this diagram over here, this is what the room actually looks like. So even though we perceive this to be a normal square room, it's actually not. Because this gentleman is further back, but the lines on the floor don't indicate that. The lines on the floor make it look like it's a normal room, and so that's why it's an illusion. We can also have other types of illusions called Muller-Lyer illusion. And this is where different lines or different organizations of things can make images appear to be wrong or incorrect when they're really not. So the first example is on top, that when you're just looking at these lines, it kind of looks like the lines are crooked, right? That they're, well, this one might be kind of straight, but then these ones are going kind of off to the side of it. But actually, all these long lines are parallel, and it's these tiny lines in between or on them that make them appear crooked because they're going in different directions. Another example would be here, where just looking at the middle circle here, which one is bigger? Now, you're probably going to use the information surrounding it to determine which one's bigger. So when just looking at them, this middle circle here appears larger, when in reality, the middle circle is the exact same size on both, but it's because of the surrounding that makes one appear larger than the other. And then finally, on the bottom, which line is longer, A or B? Now, this illusion, if you were to take a ruler and measure this main line A and B, you'd find they're the exact same. But because of the lines or the arrows on the edges of the main line, it makes A appear longer than B. And so this is how that Muller-Lyer illusions work. Is when there's two things that are the same, but surrounding information makes them appear different. Of course, there are other illusions that can use monocular depth cues rather than binocular depth cues. So monocular depth cues are manipulated to produce an impossible triangle, a never-ending staircase, and the devil's tuning fork. So this is, instead of using 3D images or like the Muller-Lyer illusions, then these monocular depth cues are taking 2D images, but using shading or lines to make them appear 3D, but create impossible images that don't make sense. So like this never-ending staircase, you're always going up, but that's impossible because you're never going anywhere, or you can always go down. So how does that work? And then the devil's tuning fork, if you actually look here, we have a line here, and it kind of just stops there. But what you, and same here, we go here, and if we go over, it goes down into this gap. And the tuning fork is the gap in the middle. And so none of this really exists, okay? So that's kind of these illusions where you're able to draw something where it gives the illusion of movement or of a shape that isn't possible to actually create in the real world. Like you can't make a wooden version or make a 3D printed version of these illusions because they're impossible. And then different illusions work for humans or no longer work based on experience and perception. So for instance, this baby is crawling and it was uncheckered, and now there's a piece of glass. But if you look down, then there's still the same checkered pattern. So when the baby crawls across, the baby's probably going to just think it's the same checkered pattern. Or what the baby might think is that there's going to be a large drop when there's not, because it can't process that there is a pane of glass because it hasn't experienced that before. Another example would be here. What is this, the archer shooting at? Is he shooting the elephant or is he shooting the antelope? So based on experience, we would say he's going to shoot the antelope because you can't really kill an elephant with one arrow. But if you didn't have any experience, then based on perception, it looks like he's pointing at the elephant rather than the antelope. So this is where experience can also come into play with your perception of how the world works, and help you understand different illusions as you get older. So that's it for sensation and perception. I hope you enjoyed it. And next week, then we will start chapter 5.